8:15 on a Saturday morning in early September, Russell Cobb and his 15-year-old son Tyler pulled into a dirt lot off a gravel road in southern Utah, grabbed 2 day packs from the trunk, and started walking toward a slot canyon that didn't have an official name on any park map. By 2 p.m., both of them were trapped 15 feet underwater in a canyon less than 4 feet wide, with a wall of floodwater bearing down on them that had started as a thunderstorm neither of them had seen, 20 miles away, 3 hours earlier. This is the story of a father-son trip that went wrong, not because of one dramatic mistake, but because of a series of small, understandable ones, the kind that happen every single monsoon season in the canyon country of the American Southwest. Russell Cobb was 44, an experienced day hiker who had brought his son on dozens of trips across Utah and Arizona over the years. Established trails, well-documented routes, national park hikes with clear signage and other visitors nearby. This trip was meant to be something a little different. A friend from work had mentioned a slot canyon a few hours from home, a narrow, technical route that wasn't in any of the mainstream guidebooks, the kind of place you found through word of mouth or a single forum post, not through an official trailhead kiosk. Tyler had just turned 15. He'd been asking for something more adventurous than the family's usual hikes, steeper trails, less crowded places, something that felt more like the outdoor content he watched online. Russell, wanting to give his son exactly that kind of experience and feeling confident in his own decade of hiking experience, agreed. He'd looked at a basic trail description online a few days earlier. Distance, difficulty rating, a couple of photos. He hadn't looked much further than that. There was no permit system for this particular canyon, no ranger station nearby, no posted flash flood advisory board at a trailhead, because there was no official trailhead at all. It was simply a wash that narrowed into a slot a mile or so upstream from where the dirt road ended. The night before the trip, Russell checked the weather for their destination town. Clear skies, a high in the mid-80s, a small chance of afternoon showers that the forecast listed as isolated and minor. He didn't check the forecast for the broader watershed, the wider drainage area of higher elevation terrain that fed into the canyon from miles away. He didn't know at the time that this was a meaningfully different piece of information from the forecast for the town itself. Most people don't. The morning began exactly the way Russell had hoped it would. Clear sky, comfortable temperature, Tyler genuinely excited in a way he hadn't been about a hike in months. They parked, shouldered 2 day packs, snacks, 2 liters of water each, a basic first aid kit, a phone with limited service already showing at the trailhead, and started up the wash toward the canyon entrance. They were not equipped for a technical canyoneering descent, and they didn't need to be, based on what Russell had read. This particular slot was described as a scramble, not a rappel, narrow but walkable, no ropes required, roughly a 3-hour round trip for a reasonably fit hiker. What Russell hadn't planned for, because he hadn't thought to ask the question at all, was what to do if conditions changed once they were inside. They reached the canyon's entrance a little over an hour after setting out. The transition was dramatic in the way these places always are, open desert wash giving way, almost abruptly, to smooth sandstone walls rising on either side, the trail narrowing until Tyler, walking ahead, had to turn his shoulders sideways to fit through in places. Tyler loved it immediately. He was taking photos on his phone, running his hand along the polished rock, asking his dad questions about how the canyon had been carved this way. Russell explained what he knew. Water, over thousands of years, cutting through the stone. The same explanation any parent might give, technically accurate but incomplete in a way that would matter enormously a few hours later. He didn't mention, because he didn't fully understand it himself, that the water responsible for carving this canyon didn't need to be falling on them directly to reach them again. They moved slowly, stopping often for photos, working through a few short scrambles over boulders wedged in the passage. It was, by any measure, a genuinely good morning. This was exactly the kind of experience Russell had wanted to give his son. At almost the exact same time Russell and Tyler were working their way deeper into the slot, a thunderstorm was building over a plateau roughly 20 miles from where they stood, terrain neither of them could see, separated from the canyon by miles of high desert and a ridgeline that blocked any visual line of sight between the two locations. This is the detail at the center of the entire story, and it's worth being precise about it. The storm that would ultimately threaten their lives was not a storm they could have seen coming by looking at the sky above them. The sky above the Slot Canyon that morning was almost entirely clear. There was no darkening horizon, no distant rumble, nothing that matched what either of them would have instinctively recognized as a warning sign. The National Weather Service had in fact issued a flash flood watch for the broader region that covered this specific drainage, a watch that had been posted the previous evening and updated that morning, publicly available to anyone who checked a regional watershed forecast rather than a single town's local weather. Russell had not checked it because he did not know, walking into this trip, that this specific piece of information existed or that it applied to where they were headed. The storm intensified through the late morning, dropping a significant volume of rain onto sandstone terrain that absorbed almost none of it. Every drop began running downhill, gathering speed and volume, funneling toward the lowest points in the landscape, exactly the kind of narrow drainage that Russell and Tyler were now several hundred yards inside of. By noon, Russell and Tyler had covered close to a mile inside the Slot Canyon. The walls here rose 60 feet or more on either side, the passage narrowing in places to barely more than an arm's span. They had reached what Tyler, checking a photo he'd seen online before the trip, recognized as the canyon's most photogenic section, a stretch where shafts of midday light dropped down through the narrow gap above, illuminating the curved walls in a way that looked almost unreal. They stopped here for a while, ate lunch sitting on a smooth section of rock. Tyler took more photos, several videos, clearly already imagining how he'd describe this to friends. Neither of them checked a phone for signal at this point, and it likely wouldn't have mattered if they had. Cell coverage inside a canyon with 60-foot sandstone walls is effectively non-existent almost everywhere in this kind of terrain, regardless of what carrier or device someone is using. Any flash flood warning issued that morning, updated as the storm intensified, had no way of reaching either of them once they were this far inside. This is the structural reality of slot canyons that makes them uniquely dangerous during monsoon season, and it's a reality that applied to Russell and Tyler exactly the same way it applies to every hiker who enters terrain like this. The moment you commit to the slot, you are also, without necessarily realizing it, committing to being unreachable by any warning system for as long as you remain inside. At around 1 p.m., still deep in the canyon and continuing further in rather than turning back, Tyler noticed something and pointed it out to his father, a faint, low sound somewhere ahead or behind them, hard to place exactly. Neither of them recognized it for what it was. It could have been wind moving through the narrow passage, a sound the canyon had already produced a few times that morning, drawing brief comment and nothing more. Russell, an experienced hiker but not someone with specific training in flash flood recognition, did what a reasonable, cautious parent would do with limited specific knowledge. He paused, listened for a few seconds, decided it was likely just the wind or an echo, and they continued. This is one of the most consequential moments in the entire day, and it's worth being honest about why it's so easy to understand, even in hindsight. The distinctive sound of an approaching flash flood, often described by survivors of other incidents as a low, growing rumble, sometimes accompanied by a rush of displaced air moving ahead of the water itself, is not something most people have ever been taught to specifically listen for. Russell had spent a decade hiking well-marked, well-traveled trails. Nothing in that experience had ever required him to learn what a flash flood sounds like from half a mile away, echoing through solid rock. They kept walking deeper into the slot. What happened next unfolded in a matter of minutes. The first sign that registered as unmistakably wrong was a shift in the air itself, a sudden cool draft pushing through the narrow canyon ahead of them, carrying a smell Tyler would later be unable to fully describe, except as wet dirt but stronger. Then, almost immediately after, the low sound both of them had dismissed 20 minutes earlier returned, and this time there was no mistaking it for wind. Russell's first instinct, the one that likely gave them the only chance they had, was to look up rather than to look for an exit, scanning the walls on either side of them for any kind of elevated ledge, any break in the sheer rock that might offer height above whatever was coming. He found one, a narrow shelf, maybe 8 feet up the canyon wall, accessible by a series of rough handholds in the sandstone. It wasn't much, but it was something. He got Tyler up first, boosting him from below, then scrambled up himself as the sound behind them grew from a rumble into something closer to a roar. The flood reached them seconds after Russell pulled himself onto the ledge. What came through the canyon was not a gradual rise in water level. It was a surge, a wall of churning, debris-laden water that filled the narrow passage from wall to wall almost instantly, carrying branches, rocks, and sediment collected from 20 miles of watershed in the span of little more than an hour. The water rose past the ledge Russell and Tyler had climbed onto within moments of the flood's arrival. The shelf that had seemed like genuine refuge from the canyon floor turned out to offer only a few feet of margin against a flood surge that filled far more of the canyon's vertical space than either of them could have anticipated. They were forced to climb further, scrambling up whatever additional handholds the rock offered above the ledge, Russell pushing Tyler ahead of him toward a slightly higher outcropping while the water continued to rise beneath them. For several minutes, minutes that Tyler would later describe as feeling far longer than they actually were, both of them clung to narrow holds on the canyon wall, feet braced against whatever purchase the sandstone offered, the roaring floodwater churning past just below them, close enough that spray reached their legs. The water crested slightly below where they had climbed to, then, gradually, began to recede, not because the danger had fully passed, but because the initial surge, the most violent pulse of the flood, had moved on downstream, leaving a still swollen but no longer catastrophically rising channel behind it. Russell and Tyler remained on the canyon wall for nearly 2 hours after the initial surge passed, unwilling to descend into water that, while lower, was still moving with a speed and volume that made any attempt to walk or wade through it genuinely dangerous. The canyon continued producing smaller pulses of runoff as the storm's rainfall continued draining through the watershed above them, each one a fresh reminder that the danger hadn't fully ended just because the worst moment had. They had no way to call for help. No one outside the canyon knew, with any specificity, where they had gone that day. Russell had mentioned the trip to his wife only in general terms, a rough location and an expected return time that had already passed by the time the water receded enough for them to consider moving. Eventually, with the canyon floor passable again, though still running with cold, muddy water well above their ankles in places, they made their way back out the way they had come, a slower, far more cautious retreat than the confident morning walk in had been. Nothing about the morning's planning had made that survival more likely. The forecast Russell checked covered the wrong location. The distant sound both of them heard and dismissed was the flood itself, already announcing its approach from around a bend in the canyon they couldn't see past. The decision to keep moving deeper into the slot after lunch, rather than treating the unfamiliar sound as a reason to turn back immediately, cost them time and distance that on a day with a slightly larger or slightly faster moving storm would very likely have been the difference that mattered. The storm that nearly killed Russell and Tyler Cobb was 20 miles away when it started, over terrain neither of them could see, under a sky above them that stayed clear for almost the entire time they were in danger. That is the single fact at the center of every Slot Canyon flood story, like this one, real or otherwise. The sky above you tells you nothing about the water that's already on its way. The only forecast that matters is the one for the entire watershed above the canyon, not the town nearest the trailhead, and the only moment you have to act on that information is before you're inside a canyon wall that no warning, however accurate, will ever be able to reach.